German Expressionism was a movement that appeared during, but mainly after, the First World War, reaching a peak in 1920s Berlin. Expressionism was a reaction to Impressionism, rejecting the call to represent the world as it is, and instead favouring expressions of the artist's emotion towards the subject matter.
The cabinet of Dr. Caligari is often cited by critics as the epitome of German Expressionist filmmaking. Directed by Robert Wiener in 1920, the film tells the surreal tale of a mad hypnotist by Caligari who used his sleepwalking henchmen to commit a series of murders. The film follows the young protagonist Francis as his retrospectively recounts his investigation into the mystery of his friend's death.
The film's visuals are immediately recognisable as conforming to the German Expressionist style. The characters exist in a high-contrast black and white world of deliberate distortions in perspective, form, dimensions and scale. The jagged landscape of sharp twisting angles, tilted walls and windows, staircases climbing impossible mad diagonals, trees with spiky leaves and grass that looks like knives create an atmosphere of nightmarish instability, like the world the designers created could collapse at any moment. In fact, painters and stage set designers Walter Reimann and Walter Rohrig were enlisted by the film's art director, Hermann Worm, contributing to the film's self-consciously artificial, unreal look.
The viewer questioning what is real and what is imaginary.
The soul of German Expressionism is the reimagination of the world as a space reflecting the emotional, rather than physical realities of existence. Take, for example, this scene, set in the lunatic asylum's courtyard. The characters seem too big for the small building, and the floor features a bizarre pattern, highlighting the patient's disturbed states of mind.
Of this scene in a prison cell, where the long vertical shadow resembling a low head are painted into the set itself and pointed towards the prisoner squatting on the floor, emphasizing his oppressed state of mind. The overall expression critique of the viewer is that the story takes place in the world transformed by evil.
In 1920, Germany was still recovering from the physical and psychological horrors of the First World War. There was a sense that the real world was simultaneously too brutal and insufficiently emotionally evocative, as audiences had become desensitized to atrocity. Expressionism offered a way of transforming that pain into beauty. Intriguingly, it was the film's design elements that informed the tone of the rest of the film. Werner Krauss, the actor who played Caligari, suggested changes to makeup and costume to fit in with the expressionist sets, and even his movements take on an unreal, angular ferocity, as if he has been broken by the emotional force within himself.
But what is perhaps most interesting about the film's aesthetic is that it was created out of financial necessity as much as artistic impulse. The painted canvases were approved by the film's executives because they were cheap and small enough to build in studios which had been hit hard by Germany's economic downturn following the First World War. Film critic Hans Janowitz asked the question,
Was this particular style of painting only a garment in which to dress the drama? Highlighting an interesting dilemma, is a film truly able to reflect the transgressive elements of an artistic movement, or does it just mimic the style in order to visually entice an audience?
The dramatic, stylized aesthetics of German Expressionism were the roots of the film noir period in Hollywood cinema from the 1940s to 50s. Due to increased opportunities and later the threat of growing Nazi power, many important film artists from Germany who had either been directly involved in the Expressionist movement or studied with its practitioners moved to America. Noir appeared out of the Second World War, and thus the movement is not so much of a genre,
but rather that of a mood. Film noir had a trend of a black, downbeat and dark aesthetic,
with the cohesion of the black and white format tying together this view.
One example that clearly illustrated this influence is Charles Laughton's 1955 film The Night of the Hunter. The Night of the Hunter follows the story of two children, John and Pearl, whose kind but criminal father leaves them with a sum of large money before being hanged for his crime. The murderous Harry Powell marries the children's mother in order to get closer to the fortune.
Though now considered a classic, the film was originally panned by critics and audiences, who favoured new widescreen and colour technologies. Laughton was inspired by the silent era Expressionism films in order to create an unsettling, slightly unreal and dreamlike tone. For example, we see the children's mother being killed by Powell in a highly composed scene which uses shadows and light to heighten the tension.
In all the films we have chosen, the emphasis of evil is focused on one garish character, whose aim within the narrative is to threaten the moral balance of good and evil. These characters' nightmarish qualities are enhanced through extreme characteristics that evoke the illustrative. Through makeup, sound, lighting and movement, the characters become illustrations themselves. For example, in Night of the Hunter.
This is a characterising feature, much like his love and hate knuckles that help reflect his dark intentions.
Most film sets would use 10 lights to give a natural, full-bodied light to the scene, but for key moments in Night of the Hunter, Stanley Cortez, the lighting director, used only 4 lights, stating that this helped to achieve
the dramatic communication that I wanted the audience to get. This limited lighting adds to the dreamlike feel of a piece and heightens the theatricality of the dark plot.
Night of the Hunter is entirely filmed on a pre-built set, indicating the dishonesty by creating something which replicates the real world. Reality is not enough for the story. The imagination is more evocative than any real images or places. In Night of the Hunter, the set inside the house perfectly reflects this storytelling. Though outside the world is simple and wholesome,
It's behind closed doors that the set turns jagged and frightening.
The bedroom scene is obviously artificial, with a high-pointed church-like roof.
This is, however, only until the second half of the film, when the children run away from Powell, when the outside set becomes much more ominous and imposing, almost reflecting the fact that the preacher is looking for them, manifesting himself in the very environment which surrounds them. The way these sets are made, as with the other two films, is anything but seamless, which harks back to the aesthetic nature of the German Expressionists. There is this slight, illustrative, handmade quality to the film, which enhances the theatrical storytelling.
The Babadook, a 2014 film directed by Jennifer Kent, is about a single mother who loses her husband and in an attempt to deal with her depression, represses her grief until it becomes externally manifested in the form of a monstrous character in a children's book, Mr. Babadook. Focusing on the perspective of Samuel, the child, who is too young to understand concepts such as grief or depression, we see these emotions affecting his mother every day. The Babadook character is how Samuel sees his mother's emotions. The set design is also quintessential to this idea. As with the other two films we have talked about, the majority of the film was shot on one set, fabricated entirely for this film. Kent talked about creating
a world unique unto itself, as her narrative could not have existed in a real space.
The set designers used unusually dark edgings on door frames and skirting boards to contribute to the dark tone of the film. The house therefore seems real, but slightly unusual, contributing to an unsettling sense of the uncanny. The set is made up of an incredibly restricted colour palette of blacks, blues, greys and maroons, which were directly inspired by traditional fairy tale illustrations such as the Brothers Grimm.
The combination of atmospheric colors and unnatural lighting allowed for a contemporary exploration of Expressionism. The film was originally based on Kent's 2004 short film Monster, which was shot in black and white, and their explicit reference to expressionist films such as Nosferatu. The Babadook is a product of the main character's darkest emotions, so it was vital for the visual aesthetic to bring what was happening inside her emotions into the external world. This is one of the main purposes of Expressionism. When it began, it came from a post-war period where people were suffering from both physical and mental wounds.
They were not ready to approach a concept of emotion so openly. It had to be visually metaphorical.
This is similar to the way that Amelia refuses to openly admit to her emotions. She pushes it far down and eventually it manifests externally into visual being.
The book is a very important point in the film. However, it was not simply created as a prop. Rather, the aesthetic of the film was heavily influenced by Alex Juhad's creation.
The simplicity of the illustrations connect to our instincts of fear and what is real or not. The childish rendering of the Babadook becomes unsettling. It leads to the question of who is behind the book. Similarly, jerky, low-tech stop-motion animation is used to create an unnatural sense of movement when the Babadook appears, like the haunting motions of Dracula and Nosferatu. Throughout the production, Kent kept returning to the traditional methods of favouring puppetry, for example, over CGI, saying,
There can be something really visceral about things created in camera. You get the feeling that something was there.
The films we have focused on come from 3 different countries and at 3 different time periods representing almost 100 years of Western cinematic heritage.
Yet, despite their differences, they all have one thing in common. They acknowledge that there comes a certain point in the story when the purely cinematic just won't do.
In order to really play on an audience imagination and inspire genuine feelings of horror, the film must resort to illustrative techniques.